winter of 1912, a stagecoach driver arrived at the Crescent Peak Hotel high in the Colorado Rockies, only to find every door wide open, fires still burning, dinner still warm, and every single guest gone. Luggage remained unpacked, glasses half full on tables and a baby's cry echoing faintly from an empty hallway. What began as a bustling mountain getaway had, overnight, become a tomb of silence. Locals would later swear that something unnatural moved through those halls that night, something that called out names no one else could hear. The hotel still stands today, but no one dares stay past sundown. In the late 1800s, Colorado was in the throes of transformation, a land of promise, peril, and gold. Deep within the San Juan Mountains, where the air thinned and the pines pressed in close, prospectors carved out trails and small towns that shimmered with brief prosperity before vanishing into dust. It was in this rugged wilderness, on a lonely plateau 9,000 feet above sea level, that the Crescent Peak Hotel was conceived. The story of its construction begins not with a grand architectural vision, but with one man's obsession. Jonathan Merrick was a railroad magnate from St. Louis, a man known for turning wilderness into wealth. In 1895, he visited Colorado in search of new mining investments and fell in love with the view from Crescent Peak, a natural ridge shaped like a half moon, overlooking miles of untouched valley. Locals warned him of unstable ground and treacherous winters, but Merrick was enchanted. He decided that atop this desolate mountain, he would build a retreat for the nation's elite, a Hawaii, place where moneyed travelers could experience the raw majesty of the Rockies without sacrificing. Luxury construction began in the spring of 1896. Lumber, bricks, and iron fittings had to be hauled up the narrow mountain trail by mule teams, taking nearly 2 days per trip. Workers slept in tents, enduring snow squalls even in May. Many quit within weeks, unnerved by the eerie quiet of the mountain and the strange sounds that came from beneath their feet. Low rumblings that miners claimed were the mountain breathing. A few laborers vanished altogether, assumed to have fallen into ravines or been claimed by wild animals. Merrick dismissed such talk as superstition, offering double pay to anyone who stayed through the season. By 1898, the Crescent Peak Hotel was complete, a 3-story marvel of timber and stone, with 24 guest rooms, a grand dining hall, and a wraparound veranda that offered a sweeping view of the valleys below. It was lit by gas lamps imported from New York, and boasted one of the first telephone connections in the region. The lobby featured a fireplace big enough to stand in, lined with black marble that reflected the flames in shifting patterns. Everything about the place was meant to impress. Guests arriving by stagecoach were greeted by polished brass, velvet drapes, and the faint scent of pine smoke and perfume. But beneath its splendor, the hotel carried an unease no luxury could hide. The building sat directly above an abandoned silver mine, an old shaft sealed decades earlier after a collapse killed 19 men. Some locals whispered that Merrick knew this and built over it deliberately, chasing the legend that the mine still held untapped veins of ore. Others believed he was drawn to something far less tangible. Servants reported that Merrick spent long nights alone in the cellar, sketching strange geometric diagrams and speaking under his breath. When the hotel opened officially on June 3, 1898, it was an instant curiosity. Wealthy travelers from Chicago and Boston made the journey to experience what newspapers called the Jewel of the Rockies. They dined on imported wines, played piano in the lounge, and told ghost stories by the fire. Yet even in its prime, Crescent Peak had trouble keeping staff. Chambermaids refused to clean certain rooms, claiming to hear voices whispering through the floorboards. Guests occasionally complained of doors locking on their own, of mirrors fogging with handprints though the air was dry. Jonathan Merrick brushed off every rumor, insisting the mountain's isolation played tricks on tired minds. But in private letters discovered years later, he confessed to hearing something himself, what he called a low hum, rhythmic and deep, as though the earth were remembering something ancient. He never explained what that meant. Merrick died suddenly in 1903, found in his study with a glass of whiskey still in his hand, eyes wide open as if he had seen someone standing in the doorway. After his death, the hotel changed hands twice, each new owner struggling to keep it profitable. Yet for nearly 15 years, the Crescent remained a hidden gem for those who sought both seclusion and spectacle. By 1912, it was running on fading grandeur, its carpets frayed, its piano out of tune, but it still stood proud against the mountain wind, a stubborn monument to man's desire to tame the untamable. No one then could have guessed that within months, it would become a monument to something far darker. The winter of 1912 arrived early in the San Juan Mountains, creeping down from the peaks like a living thing. By late November, the trails to Crescent Peak were buried under 6 feet of snow, and the few remaining staff members at the hotel spoke of strange drafts that moved through the halls, even when every window was shut. The caretaker, Thomas Gray, noted in his journal that the fireplaces burn longer than they should, as if the air itself feeds the flame. That December, the Crescent Peak Hotel would host its final group of guests, an unlikely gathering drawn together by circumstance, weather, and fate. There were 12 names in the register that week. The first was Henry Alcott, a mining engineer from Denver who had come to inspect nearby claims. Next were Samuel and Louise Turner, a newlywed couple traveling west for their honeymoon. 3 merchants from Chicago arrived soon after, claiming they were taking a scenic detour before heading to San Francisco. There was also an elderly schoolteacher named Margaret Pruitt, who wrote in her travel diary that she wanted a few quiet days in the mountains before the year's end. 2 sisters, Clara and Ruth Danvers, checked in under mysterious circumstances, carrying trunks far too heavy for a short stay. And lastly, there was a man who signed the register simply as Dr. W. H. Rourke. No listed hometown, no company, no known reason for being there. The storm began on the evening of December 13th. Winds roared through the pass with such ferocity that windows rattled in their frames. Guests gathered in the dining hall where the staff served hot cider and roasted lamb while snow piled against the doors. Witnesses from town later said they could see faint lights flickering on the mountain that night, glowing blue-white through the storm, though the hotel's power came only from gas lamps. By the second day, the roads were completely impassable. The telegraph line snapped somewhere down the mountain, cutting off all communication. Inside, the guests made the best of their isolation. The Danvers sisters played piano in the lounge, Margaret Pruitt read aloud by the fire, and Dr. Rourke entertained them with stories of his medical work during the Spanish flu outbreaks. But the staff began to notice subtle changes. Food spoiled faster than usual despite the cold. The clock stopped twice in one evening. One chambermaid swore she saw a figure walking the upper balcony after midnight, though every room was accounted for. On the morning of December 16th, Thomas Gray wrote his last entry. The air is different today. Still. Heavy. The guests are uneasy. Some claim to hear knocking in the walls. Mr. Alcott said the snow outside isn't right, that it's sinking even where there's no slope. That afternoon, several guests reported the same dream, a door at the end of a long hallway opening onto pure darkness. None could remember what came after. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped below 0. The staff lit every fireplace in the building, but the warmth wouldn't hold. The Danvers sisters, described as devoutly religious, began praying in the lobby. Others huddled in silence. Around 11 p.m., the power flickered, and all at once, every lamp went out. In that darkness, one of the merchants screamed. He said he saw someone standing in the corner, someone who hadn't been there moments before. The storm raged for 2 more days. When the winds finally calmed and the stagecoach from Silvercrest attempted to reach the hotel on December 20th, it found no signs of life. Smoke still rose from the chimneys, but the building was silent. The great doors of the Crescent Peak Hotel stood ajar, snow blowing through the entrance and piling across the polished floors. On the dining table, plates of untouched food had frozen solid. The chairs were toppled over as if in panic. Upstairs, beds were unmade, suitcases open, belongings scattered. But not a single guest or staff member remained. The only trace of the living was a set of footprints in the main hall that stopped abruptly in front of the cellar door. When the sheriff opened it, he found nothing below but still air and the faint echo of dripping water. On the wall above the door, carved deep into the wood, was a new message. Letters rough and uneven, as if gouged in haste. She called us by name. When Sheriff Walter Beach arrived at the Crescent Peak Hotel 3 days after the storm cleared, he expected to find a scene of tragedy. Perhaps an avalanche had trapped the guests or a fire had driven them into the cold. Instead, what he found was something far stranger. Beach was a pragmatic man, a veteran of the Spanish-American War who didn't believe in superstition. But as soon as he stepped through the front doors, the hair on his arms rose. The air inside was warm yet unnaturally still, as though the entire building had been holding its breath for days. The fire in the great hearth was still burning low, its embers glowing faintly untouched. His deputy, a young man named Ernest Lowe, called out, "Sheriff, you better come see this." In the dining room, 12 plates were still set, each with food half eaten, frozen in place, cups of tea turned to slush. One chair was pulled slightly back as if someone had just stood up moments ago. On the far wall, a framed portrait of Jonathan Merrick hung crooked, the glass cracked straight across the eyes. Beach took out his notebook, writing, "No signs of struggle. Fire active. No tracks outside but horses and wind." They searched the first floor first. The reception desk was neat, the guest ledger open to the last page. The handwriting stopped mid-sentence, Dr. Rourke requesting cellar key for, and then nothing. Beach's lantern trembled slightly in his hand as he stared at the unfinished line. Upstairs, the rooms told the same story. Beds unmade, trunks open, personal belongings left behind. Margaret Pruitt's diary lay on her nightstand, the final entry scrawled hastily. Voices in the hallway again. We thought it was the wind until it said my name. In one of the suites, a music box sat on a dresser, its mechanism still ticking faintly, though the key hadn't been wound. The Danvers sisters' room smelled faintly of lavender and candle wax. Both of their dresses hung neatly in the wardrobe, but their shoes were missing. On the wall beside the mirror, a childlike handprint appeared in soot, small, smudged, and upside down. Beach didn't mention it to his deputy. By mid-afternoon, the men reached the cellar door. It was locked from the inside. They forced it open, the hinges groaning as cold air poured out. The smell hit them first, damp stone and iron. Their lanterns illuminated the narrow staircase spiraling downward, walls slick with frost. The cellar was nearly empty except for a few barrels and an old furnace still faintly warm to the touch. Beach noticed scratch marks along the floor, as though something heavy had been dragged toward the far wall. When they brushed away the dust, they found the carvings. "The mountain takes back what's hers." The words were etched deep into the wooden planks, each letter uneven, frantic. Lowe muttered, "Maybe they went out another way." But there were no footprints, no broken windows, no sign of forced exit. The snow outside was pristine. The sheriff ordered a perimeter search. For 2 hours, his men circled the property, shouting names into the wind. No one answered. Only once did Beach think he heard something, a faint echo from the ridge above, almost like laughter carried through the trees. When they climbed to check, there was nothing but a frozen fox lying in the snow, its eyes wide open, unmarked by any wound. Back at the hotel, Beach gathered his men by the fire to warm up. He wrote a preliminary report by lantern light, noting every anomaly, the unspoiled valuables, the missing guests, the lack of struggle. He ended the page with one observation he never shared publicly. The silence here isn't empty, it's listening. As the sun set behind the mountains, shadows stretched long through the hallways. The building groaned as temperature dropped, the timbers creaking in slow rhythm. Lowe swore he heard footsteps above them, but when Beach investigated, there was nothing. Still, as they prepared to leave, Beach glanced once more toward the upper balcony. For a moment, only a moment, he thought he saw someone standing there. A tall man, coat-buttoned, watching them. But when Beach raised his lantern, the figure dissolved into darkness. He locked the doors behind him and sealed the property, instructing that no one return until spring. But the sheriff would never forget that day. In later years, when asked about the Crescent Peak case, he'd always hesitate before answering. He'd say there were no bodies, no blood, and no clues. Yet he would pause just before the end, his eyes distant, and add softly, "There was something there, though. Something that didn't want to be found." In the weeks that followed the sheriff's investigation, word of the Crescent Peak Hotel spread through the valleys of Colorado like wildfire. Newspapers in Denver ran the story under bold headlines, "Guests Vanish in Mountain Hotel," and reporters began arriving in the nearby town of Silvercrest, hungry for details. But the truth was far stranger than the rumors. When the sheriff's men returned to document the evidence, they found the hotel exactly as they had left it, untouched, undisturbed, as though time itself refused to move forward inside those walls. The air smelled of smoke and cedar, and the fires still burned, though no one had added wood since the initial discovery. Inside, the evidence was as haunting as it was impossible to explain. The dining room looked frozen in motion, half-filled glasses, forks still resting on plates, chairs turned slightly away from the table, as if a dozen people had risen at once. A single violin lay on the piano bench, its strings snapped, the bow fallen to the floor. Upstairs, in one of the guest rooms, the words "she called us" were scratched into the frost on a window pane. No footprints led to or from the spot, and the frost never melted even as the lantern heat filled the room. One of the most disturbing discoveries was in the manager's office. On the desk sat an open notebook belonging to Thomas Gray, the caretaker. The last 2 pages were soaked through as though with water, or something darker. The final words, barely legible, read, "They're gathering by the door. The mountain hums." No one could say what he meant, but when examined later, the notebook's edges showed traces of iron oxide, similar to the residue left by blood. Perhaps the most puzzling object found in the building was in the basement. Hidden behind a stack of barrels was a large mirror, covered by a dusty sheet. When the sheriff removed it, they found faint streaks running down the glass as though something, or someone, had pressed their hands against it from the inside. The mirror itself was cracked in a peculiar pattern, spidering out from the center in a perfect circle. Some of the townsfolk believed it wasn't a mirror at all, but a remnant from the old mine tunnels below, a piece of polished obsidian used by miners to gauge light. Whether that's true or not, no one ever explained how it ended up in the hotel's cellar. The sheriff took what evidence he could: Gray's notebook, the guest register, and a single silver locket found in one of the upstairs rooms. The locket contained a small, faded photograph of 2 women, believed to be the Danvers sisters. When it was opened, witnesses claimed to hear a faint ringing sound like distant chimes. The sheriff kept the locket locked in his desk for years, and when he died in 1927, it disappeared from the records entirely. Back in Silvercrest, townspeople began reporting strange occurrences within days of the investigation. Horses refused to take the mountain road. A telegraph operator claimed to receive a signal from the Crescent, though the wires had long been cut. One message repeated for nearly an hour before fading into static. "Still here, still waiting." It was later dismissed as interference, but the operator resigned the following week and never returned. Locals who dared to hike up near the hotel swore that the air grew colder the closer they came, and that the snow around the property never melted even in summer. One group of prospectors who camped near the ridge claimed to see lanterns moving through the trees at night, slow, steady lights that vanished whenever they tried to approach. When they returned to town, one of the men was missing. His footprints stopped halfway down the trail, as if he'd simply been lifted from the ground. Investigators and historians over the years tried to make sense of it all. Some argued that the evidence suggested carbon monoxide poisoning, hallucinations brought on by gas leaks, or a coordinated disappearance staged for insurance fraud. But others couldn't explain the sheer stillness of the scene, or why the fires had continued to burn, or how the snow outside remained unbroken for miles. Every clue in that building contradicted reason. It was as though whatever happened inside the Crescent Peak Hotel had rewritten the laws of nature for a single night, and then sealed itself shut. In the years that followed the disappearance at the Crescent Peak Hotel, the story became one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in Colorado's history. Dozens of theories emerged, each one darker, stranger, and more desperate than the last. Locals, historians, and self-proclaimed investigators all tried to explain how 12 people could vanish from a locked building without a trace. Yet every explanation only deepened the mystery. Some spoke of an avalanche, others of madness brought on by isolation, but none could account for the silence that lingered within those walls, or the carvings that warned, "The mountain takes back what's hers." The first theory to gain attention was the avalanche explanation. The San Juan Mountains were notorious for deadly snowslides, and several experts insisted that a hidden drift had swept the guests away during the storm. But this theory fell apart almost immediately. No collapse was ever found, and the snow around the hotel had remained perfectly still. No sign of movement, no buried bodies, no broken trees. The Crescent stood untouched as if the storm had respected its boundaries. The second theory, popular among the sheriff's deputies, blamed carbon monoxide poisoning. The old coal furnace in the basement, they argued, could have leaked gas, causing hallucinations, panic, and eventual flight into the wilderness. Perhaps the guests wandered into the blizzard, disoriented, never to be found. It seemed logical, until investigators tested the furnace and found it in perfect working order. The fires had been burning cleanly, with no evidence of soot or gas buildup. And even if the poisoning theory were true, it still didn't explain the carvings, the locked cellar door, or the strange preservation of the scene as though time itself had stopped the moment the guests vanished. Another group, led by a Denver journalist named Edwin Greer, claimed the incident was a hoax, a publicity stunt gone horribly wrong. He suggested that the hotel's owner, long in debt, staged the disappearance to create a legend that would attract future visitors. But when Greer hiked to the site himself in 1915, he found no evidence of forgery. What he did find was far worse. In his published notes, he described hearing faint music echoing from inside the boarded-up building. When he entered, he found the piano in the parlor still standing, its keys dusted over. Yet when he pressed one key at random, a faint vibration trembled through the floor, as if something deep below had responded. Greer left before nightfall and never returned. By the 1920s, a new theory emerged, one rooted in folklore rather than science. Older residents of Silvercrest spoke of a curse placed on the mountain long before the hotel was built. According to Ute tribal legends, the ridge was once home to a sleeping woman, a spirit who guarded the land's minerals. When disturbed, she was said to reclaim what was taken from her, sometimes with storms, sometimes with silence. Archaeologists dismissed the legend as myth, but the parallels were difficult to ignore. The Crescent Peak Hotel had been built directly over an abandoned mine, and deep within its sealed tunnels were carvings resembling the same spiral symbols found near ancient Ute ceremonial grounds. As decades passed, speculation turned toward the supernatural. Ghost hunters and occultists began calling Crescent Peak a thin place, where the veil between worlds was weakest. They pointed to the written accounts left behind, Gray's journal, Margaret Pruitt's final diary entry, and the message etched into the wall, as evidence of collective hysteria triggered by something otherworldly. Paranormal societies in the 1930s claimed to have recorded low-frequency vibrations near the ruins, a hum that grew louder the deeper they ventured into the foundation. Theories of mass possession, interdimensional collapse, and even alien abduction were tossed around, each more outlandish than the last. But amid all the conjecture, one consistent thread tied every explanation together: the mountain itself. Whether viewed as geological, psychological, or spiritual, Crescent Peak seemed to be alive in some way, watching, listening, waiting. Those who spent time near it often described feeling drained, their thoughts clouded, their dreams vivid and strange. In time, the site became synonymous with dread, a symbol of humanity's arrogance in trying to civilize what was never meant to be tamed. To this day, no remains have ever been recovered from the area surrounding Crescent Peak. Not a single button, shoe, or bone. It was as if the storm swallowed them whole, or as if something beneath the mountain had simply opened its arms and taken them back. By the 1930s, the Crescent Peak Hotel was already considered cursed ground. The building still stood, its wood darkened by decades of storms, its windows shattered, its roof sagging like the bowed head of a tired giant. For years, no one dared to set foot inside. Travelers who passed through Silvercrest spoke of lights flickering in the distance on foggy nights, and locals said that when the wind blew from the north, it carried faint music, piano notes and laughter that seemed to echo from another time. But in 1936, the legend drew its first set of intruders since the disappearances, a group of investors who believed the site could be restored into a ski lodge. The restoration crew consisted of 12 men, most of them locals, and they arrived in early June with supplies and optimism. For the first few days, everything went well. The men cleared debris, patched the roof, and began replacing window frames. But by the end of the first week, strange things started happening. Tools disappeared overnight, only to be found hours later buried under snow outside. Footprints appeared in the halls, bare, wet prints leading toward the staircase and stopping abruptly in front of the cellar door. One worker, Frank Dillard, refused to go back down after hearing whispers through the floorboards. He described the sound as soft, like people talking behind a wall, but no words you could understand. By the third week, tension ran high. The men complained of sleeplessness, nightmares, and a constant feeling of being watched. One morning, The foreman discovered the words, "Still ours," carved into the banister of the main staircase. Thinking it was a prank, he ordered it sanded down. That night, the phrase reappeared, this time on the inside of the dining hall windows, written in condensation, though the air was dry. Within days, half the crew quit. The remaining men left after one of their number. A carpenter named Joe Hart vanished in broad daylight. He had been measuring the veranda railing when the others went inside for lunch. When they returned, only his tools remained. The snow beyond the balcony was untouched. The restoration project was abandoned, and the Crescent Peak Hotel was sealed once again. For nearly 40 years, it sat in isolation, visited only by daring hikers and reckless teenagers seeking thrills. But in 1974, a small independent film crew from Boulder decided to document the legend. They planned to spend one night filming inside the hotel, interviewing locals and recording atmospheric footage for a documentary about haunted places in America. The footage they recovered, though mostly lost to time, became the last visual record of the Crescent before nature began to reclaim it. According to the surviving crew members, the evening started quietly. They shot exterior scenes until sunset, capturing the long shadows stretching across the snow. Then as darkness fell, the tone shifted. Their audio equipment began picking up faint static and the lights flickered. Around midnight, one of the cameras caught something that shouldn't have been there. A faint human silhouette standing at the top of the stairs, motionless, its outline distorted by the light. Moments later, the generator died. The entire building fell silent except for a rhythmic creaking, like footsteps pacing overhead. The crew fled, leaving their equipment behind. When they returned the next morning, the generator was running again, though no one had restarted it. The film reels they recovered contained only one clear frame, the parlor piano with a single key pressed down by an unseen hand. After that, Crescent Peak was left entirely to decay. Snow collapsed part of the roof in the 1980s, and the mountain slowly swallowed the rest. Still, hikers and ghost hunters continued to report strange phenomena. Voices in the static of radios, sudden drops in temperature, even fleeting shapes moving behind the windows. Forest rangers eventually fenced off the area, declaring it unstable. But they too whispered that something about the mountain felt wrong, as though the earth itself remembered what had happened there and refused to let it fade. By the early 2000s, Crescent Peak had become a myth, the kind of story locals told with a smirk but never with certainty. The hotel no longer appeared on modern maps, buried beneath snow and time, yet whispers persisted. Satellite images revealed only a warped outline where the structure once stood. But hikers still returned from the area shaken, some refusing to talk about what they saw. It wasn't until 2008 that Crescent Peak re-emerged in public consciousness, when a group of urban explorers calling themselves Echo Division uploaded a short video titled "Inside the Forgotten Hotel." The footage went viral overnight. The video began with drone shots of the mountain, wind slicing through fog, skeletal trees clawing at the slope. Then came handheld footage of the group's ascent. There were 5 of them, all in their early 20s, laughing nervously as they trudged through snow. The camera trembled as they entered the ruins. Inside, the structure was worse than expected. Half the floors had collapsed. Furniture was frozen in place under layers of ice, and the air was thick with frost. They wandered through halls lined with peeling wallpaper and broken mirrors. For the first few minutes, it looked like a typical exploration video: dust, decay, and the thrill of trespassing. But halfway through, something changed. At the 4:17 mark, the sound cut out completely. The footage grew darker, the frame flickering as though the camera struggled to process light. One explorer whispered, "Do you hear that?" though the viewer couldn't. Then the group entered what appeared to be the ballroom, its ceiling sagging, a grand piano half buried in debris. The camera panned slowly across the room, and in that sweep, for just a fraction of a second, something moved in the background. It wasn't a shadow. It looked human, standing perfectly still near the stage. When the explorer turned back, it was gone. The video ended abruptly with static. A week later, viewers noticed the channel had been deleted. None of the members of Echo Division were heard from publicly again, except for one. A month after the upload, a user on a paranormal forum claiming to be Echo Survivor posted a single thread titled, "Don't Go Back to Crescent." The post was short. "It's still there. We thought it was empty. It isn't. The air moves on its own. The music isn't an echo, it's memory. We left something behind and it followed us. The account was deleted hours later. The FBI briefly investigated after 2 of the explorers' families filed missing person reports, but no formal search was conducted due to the area's instability. Rangers later found what appeared to be remnants of a camp near the base of the mountain: torn tents, camera batteries, and a melted handheld light. But there was one item that stood out: a digital camera buried in snow, its casing cracked but memory card intact. Only one image was recovered. It showed the interior of the ballroom, the piano in the center, and faint figures reflected in the frost-covered mirrors. There were 5 people in the photo, though only 4 explorers were visible in the shot. After that, Crescent Peak became a digital ghost story. Online communities dissected the footage, debated its authenticity, and speculated about what might have happened. Some claimed it was a marketing stunt for a horror film. Others pointed out that several local hikers went missing in the same area that winter. The story circulated for years, growing stranger with each retelling, until the mountain was finally declared a restricted zone in 2013 after multiple search parties failed to return. Yet every so often, new posts appeared under anonymous accounts: grainy photos of a snow-covered structure, faint yellow lights glowing from its windows, and the distant outline of what looked like a grand piano sitting in the snow, untouched but waiting. If you've made it this far, then you've walked the same haunted path the guests of Crescent Peak once did, a place where silence holds memory, and time itself seems afraid to move forward. Maybe it was just a hotel swallowed by isolation, or maybe something older, something patient still waits there beneath the snow. But the question remains, what really happened inside those frozen walls? And why does the mountain refuse to give up its dead? If stories like this keep you up at night, the ones history tried to bury, then make sure you subscribe. There are more places like Crescent Peak, more forgotten ruins with ledgers that end mid-sentence and voices that never stopped echoing. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think became of those missing explorers. Were they victims of the mountain or its witnesses? The truth may still be out there, hidden in another abandoned hallway, sealed behind another locked door. Stay curious, stay wary, and remember, history doesn't always stay buried.